Hello again. Welcome back to another video. In this fairly short video, we're going to be taking a look at the use of language. So really just a few points here, emphasizing some of the key takeaways from the short use of language piece that I provided you. Some overlap here as well with what I've said before, particularly in that brief introduction to philosophical argumentation. So first, when you're using language in philosophy, be as precise as possible. So there are different aims in the kind of analytic writing we do in philosophy than there is in, say, trying to produce a really great novel or poem. When you're trying to do that latter sort of writing, often having some ambiguity built into what you're saying, playing with words, having that language really evoke certain feelings, and sometimes being a little bit vague or uncertain in some sense can be really, really advantageous. And in fact, in some of the films that we're looking at in this course, I find some of the great elements in them come from how something that's said, or perhaps isn't even said, can have more than one meaning, and how there's that plurality going on. But in philosophy, when we're doing this kind of analytic writing that's really a kind of analysis, what we're really trying to do is get really clear. We're trying to really nail things down. We're trying to get rid of the vagueness and the ambiguity. We are trying to get as clear as possible. Avoid rhetorical questions. Say what you want to say. Just come out and say it. You might be wrong. Somebody might challenge you on it. That's a risk you have to take. Be a risk taker in that sense. Rhetorical questions are a way of trying to say something without really saying it. And people often do that, myself included sometimes, though I'm a risk taker in this sense. We like to put some distance between us and what we're saying, particularly if it's controversial, so that if we turn out to be wrong or somebody raises a really good objection, we can always just fall back on, well, I was just asking questions. But that's not what we're doing here. That's not what I want you doing here. You're not here just to ask questions. You're here to give answers. Not just answers, good arguments, reasons in favor of particular answers. That's really what we're trying to do. One thing you can do to try to be really clear is when you say something as clearly as you can, right, being as precise as you can with your language and so on. But even then, you see that there's potentially more than one way somebody might interpret you, is to take time and go out of your way to be clear and to specify what you don't mean. So you can take time, you can say something, right? Say something in a sentence or maybe a few sentences, and then go on to say, someone might think that I'm trying to say X, but I'm not really trying to say X at all. I'm trying to say Y. Here's why I'm not saying X. So try to be clear, be precise. Use qualifiers. So here again, if you go take a look at the text, I say a little bit more about these. Qualifiers are modifiers added to a sentence that affect how likely a claim is to be true. So qualifiers are really about probability. So I'll come back to probability in just a second. There are really three categories of claims, three kinds of modality is one way it's often talked about. There's possibility, necessity, and impossibility. If something is necessary, it has to be true or has to happen. Right? Something's impossible, it can't ever happen. Possibility is really the zone we're typically interested in, but differentiating between these three is interesting. So one sort of tired example by now, but it's a very clear one. The claim, it's impossible for a bachelor to be married. Why? Because the meaning of the word bachelor itself includes the fact that the person is not married. So it's impossible for a bachelor to be married. Similarly, by necessity, a bachelor has to be somebody who isn't married. Right? Now, making those sorts of claims about necessity and impossibility are often easiest when we're thinking in terms of concepts and really just trying to unpack a concept or a term or a word. When we're talking about the world and when we're trying to argue about things, generally we're really interested in claims of possibility. What might be true or might be false, right? That, in some sense, the gray zone, right? Where things may happen, they may not, and so we're really trying to think about reasons to think why something might be more likely to happen than not, or why one thing is more likely to be true than the other. And this is where we can come back to probability. Probability is really something that concerns the zone of possibility. It also concerns necessity and impossibility. So if something's necessary, the probability is 100%, it has to be. If it's impossible, the probability is 0%, and it has to be. Right? Possibility, though, is really anywhere in between, all the way from, well, not just 1% to 99%, but you can get as close as you want. 0.0000001, though we could go even smaller, to 99.9999999%. Right? Anything that's more than 0 and less than 100%, now we're talking about possibility. And we talk about probability in that sort of ascending scale. How likely is it to be true or false, or how likely is it to occur or not? Now, given that we're dealing with philosophy often, not necessarily always, but often, we're not going to be able to specify probability with some kind of exact number. Right? We're not going to be able to say, oh, it's 73% likely that my conclusion is true. Our reasoning just isn't precise like that. And there are efforts to try to make it that precise. I'm not expecting us to do anything like that in this course, though you may find evidence, you might cite a source such as a scientific study or something that has percentages and those sorts of probabilities built into them, and that's quite fine. But when thinking about the claims you make, pay some careful attention to what kind of claim it is. Right? Are you talking about necessity or impossibility? Are you talking about something that's possible but not necessarily true or false? If you're talking about something possible, how likely is it to be true or false? What's the probability? Right? Is it something that just may be true? Is it likely to be true? Is it almost certainly true? So think about qualifiers. Also think about quantifiers. Quantifiers concern the scope of claims. And so here's a list of quantifiers going from largest scope to smallest, right? All, most, many, some, few, at least one, none. There are some others that we could stick in there as well. But so when we're thinking about, and I go into some examples in the text, right? Say we're talking about, I don't know, dogs, right? Oh, dogs are friendly. Well, what do you mean, right? All dogs? Some dogs are not friendly. Some of them are vicious, right? Do you mean most dogs, right? Many dogs? Many is less, or it's less than most. But here again, here we can think in terms of percentages again. All is 100%. None is 0%. Most, what's most? Well, it's not all. It's not 100%. But it's still a considerable amount. But if we were really put on the spot, exactly what percentage or percentage range does most encapsulate? I don't know. I'm 80 to 99. But even that, right? Somebody wanted to say it was 75 and up. Okay, we don't have, at least in common usage, we don't have that kind of thing pinned down. We don't have it down to a percentage conversion. Oh, of course we could, and perhaps if you take a different sort of course on statistics or something like that, you might be given some kind of conversion like that. We could do that. We could try to define these. We could say, most is anything from 80 to 99% or something like that. But we don't need to. All right. Some seems to be sort of in the middle, not exactly 50-50, but we're getting in there. Few, of course, seems to be less than some. Right? At least one is really trying to specify that, look, we have there may be more, there might be many more, but say we have an example, and it could be from one of the films, it could be an example you just make up, or it could be a real scenario, it could just be something fictional. From that, if we have some kind of anecdote, we know that at least in one instance, something happens or something is true. Now, we have to think carefully about what exactly that shows us. We have to make sure that our beliefs are supported by evidence. So the fact that at least one thing happens, or at least in one scenario something's true, it doesn't tell us that it always happens or it's always true. But it does show us that, if at least one instance works that way, then it's not the case that none of the instances work that way. So think carefully about qualifiers and quantifiers. How likely is a claim to be true? And to how many members of a group, if the claim is about a group, and typically when we're thinking in terms of philosophy, we're doing something general, we're thinking in terms of groups or categories. To how many members of the group does the claim apply? Right? Most dogs are friendly, right? And that claim is highly likely to be true. 4, define your terms. Whenever you're using terms that deviate from common use, or they need to be exact. So we have a lot of words that just have common usage and that we can largely understand each other when we're using them. But in philosophy and other academic disciplines, we have developed technical vocabularies to try to succinctly express complicated ideas and concepts in fewer words and syllables than we would need if we were trying to just use those words in common use. Of course, that means that the language itself can be a little harder to understand without the appropriate kind of training, which can make some of the debates and so on seem obscure or hard to follow. But in fact, it's like a way of using a shorthand, right? You can, in some ways, think about the technical vocabularies in academic disciplines as being somewhat akin to the sorts of acronyms and short forms that people, yourself possibly included, use in things like social media and text messaging and so on, right? And look, as somebody who is not particularly savvy with a lot of that stuff, there are times when I'll have a friend or something send me some kind of acronym, you know, 3 letters or something, and I have to respond, right? I don't know what that means, right? Once it gets defined, once I understand it, it's a time saver. That's the whole point of that new kind of language, inventing that new way of communicating. That's exactly what academics are trying to do. Just we often invoke, sort of take and repurpose Greek and Latin terms to do something new, or define some new word or phrase to help us zone in on some particular thing. So it takes some work to figure out what those mean. But once you figure out what those mean, they're a time saver and help make us more precise. So when you've got a technical term like that, it has to have a specific meaning, or you're using a word in a way that's not the usual way you'd use that word. Define your terms. There's a few ways to do it, which I outline in the document. So think about that. Take some time for that. That is something, particularly in the essays, I want to see you doing. If you're using a technical term or something in a specific kind of way, take the time to specify exactly what you mean. Not only is that a good thing to do because it makes what you're writing more clear, makes it more accessible and more easily understandable by other people, but it also shows me, one, that you understand the term you're using and you're not just kind of throwing it in there because you saw it in the one of the readings and you say, well, it looks pretty fancy. I'm sure if I throw it in there somewhere, that's going to help my grade. So it shows me that you really understand what it is. And 2, it helps me know for certain that you mean the same thing by that term that, say, somebody else did, right? Or that you're using it in the same kind of way I expect you to be using it. Because even if you are using a technical or uncommon term perfectly correctly, right, in exactly the sort of way that, say, was in a reading or something like that, I can only be sure you're using it that way if you tell me. So defining your terms really helps you be extra clear. 5, don't be too passionate in your writing and in your arguments, right? This is not a knock against passion generally. I'm not saying, feel less, right? That just seems weird to say. And it's not trying to say that there's no room for passion in philosophy or academics, or even support some kind of dichotomy between reason and feeling in general. They're big topics, lots of things we can talk about there. The basic point is that passion itself isn't an argument. So when we're trying to argue with each other, we're trying to exchange reasons for why somebody should believe something, right? Here's a conclusion. Here's the thing I want you to believe. It's controversial, so it's not obviously true. Right? Here's the evidence or the reasons I'm trying to give you to believe it. If you're too passionate in your writing, there's sort of 2 parts to it. One, that passion can be mistaken for the argument. But passion itself does not constitute a good argument, in part because people can be equally passionate on different sides of a an issue or a debate or a topic, right? They can have contrary conclusions, conclusions that both can't be true, be equally passionate about both of them. So the passion itself doesn't really give us a reason to believe one over the other. So our emotions, our passions, what makes us feel a certain way are not the same thing, at least in certain ways, as good evidence for believing that something is true. So that's the one and really most important part of it. A second reason to not be too passionate in academic writing, and this is a more general one that's in some ways a little bit separate from the course, but I'll just be honest, is that in general, academics are trying to figure out the truth. Right? We're trying to figure out how things really are and what we should believe and so on in different sorts of areas, different sorts of topics, different sorts of questions. And there is a concern that too much passion can actually interfere with somebody's ability to, I'll use the phrase like soberly evaluate evidence, to be able to look at an issue and not have already jumped to some sort of conclusion, but be able to actually work through the evidence and figure out what conclusion the evidence best supports. And if we're too passionate and if just our tone comes through that way, that we think one side of an issue is obviously better or more desirable or something like that, it can express or at least be interpreted as being a bias in some kind of sense. Now, I'm not too concerned about that. It's really more that the first reason, I don't want you conflating passion for an argument, which is part of why I give this advice, but just the general tone of academic writing is a little bit more neutral, which is not to say there's no passion at all and there's no feeling. We're all trying to be robots or something like that. So there's an interesting question about whether or not robots can feel, which is actually something we're going to get around to in this course, which is pretty fun. All right, and then sixth, use punctuation correctly. So some common punctuation marks include the following, right? We have a period, use that to end a sentence. We have a comma, use that to separate items in a list or to break up a longer sentence, particularly where you naturally pause to take a breath, there's two really good spots to use commas in addition to using them in the list. One, to separate clauses. A clause in a sentence is really a part of a sentence. So if you look up under 5 there, don't be too passionate. And then after that, passion is fine, comma, but it is not an argument on its own, right? Where that comma comes in, what comes after it, the but is a conjunction, right? It shows us there's some kind of connection between what came before it and what's coming after it. And then we have it is not an argument on its own. It is not an argument on its own. It could be its own sentence. The but is doing the work of joining those things together. And when things are joined together in that way, that's where the clauses separate, right? When you can break things apart and have one thing stand on its own as a sentence, but there's some kind of connector there. That's really what clauses are. You can also use commas to offset something. So something you could otherwise put in parentheses or brackets, right? So sort of like a side remark, something that you could take out of the sentence would read perfectly fine, even if you took it out. You want to stick that information in there. You can put a set of commas around it just to indicate that it has that special status. When you're using commas that way, you can replace them with a set of parentheses or hyphens instead. Question mark. Use that when you have a question, right? And so when trying to avoid rhetorical questions, try to avoid the use of that. You can pose legitimate questions in your piece. That's fine. Of course, we're more interested in answers than questions. But if you do have a question, punctuate it with a question mark, not a period. Right? If you're trying to make a statement, then there shouldn't be a question mark there. Afterwards, we've got quotation marks. Make sure you use those when you're using somebody else's exact words. Failure to do that is plagiarism. So make sure you understand how to use quotation marks. You can also use them to denote when you are mentioning rather than using a word. For instance, if you're trying to define a particular word, put that word, whatever it is, say, you're trying to define the word, right? You say word, put it in quotation marks, means, and then you can give whatever it is. And of course, use it also if you're trying to present dialogue or something from the film or something going on piece of writing, or somebody else's exact words. Within the quotation marks there, I've got the dot, dot, dot in ellipses. You can use that to indicate when something's been left out of a quotation. Right? So you can sort of have part of a quotation, the dot, 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 and then stick something else in. One thing I've seen in student writing is that sometimes people use them at the start or the end of a quotation to indicate that, that there's more material. I don't think that's necessary. Now, if somebody else has told you to do that for a different sort of class, follow their advice, do what they want for that sake. But my advice and all I expect is to use ellipses in this way to indicate omitted material within a quotation. So you don't have to use it at the very start or very end of a quotation, because it's almost always the case that there's something more going on either end, right? There were more sentences, or there was something else to it. So you only have to use it sort of within a quotation if partway through you're leaving something out. The next piece of punctuation is an exclamation mark. Use that for emphasis, but don't overuse them, right? If every sentence has an exclamation mark, then really none of them do, because emphasis only works when something stands out more than the surrounding material. So it's okay to have some of them, but here again, having exclamation marks all over the place, this sort of falls in with 0.5 here. That probably seems like you're being a little bit too passionate. Now it seems like you're yelling all of a sudden. Just like, don't use all caps. Just don't, ever, in an academic piece. Okay, maybe there are some exceptions, but I can't think of any. So just don't do that. No all caps. The odd exclamation point, perhaps, right? But there certainly shouldn't be too many. The last piece of punctuation here is a semicolon. Semicolons are probably the trickiest piece of punctuation to use in the English language, certainly the most complex one I'm aware of. The most important thing to keep in mind with semicolons is that when used normally within a sentence, they can be replaced by periods, not by commas. Even though it kind of looks like a comma because of what's going on the bottom, it's really the period that the semicolon is the, cousin of, or something like that. So you can really use semicolons in two ways. One is you can use it in a list instead of commas. It's particularly useful to use in a list when you have items. It's a complicated list, and the items in the list themselves have commas in them. Then using semicolons is a good way to break up and break up the chunks of that list. So that's one way to use them. Another way to use the semicolon, if you're not using it in a list, is by putting it there in place of a period between two independent clauses. And an independent clause is really a clause or part of a sentence that could be its own sentence. This is why a semicolon is replaceable by a period, not a comma. Because if you have two independent clauses and then no conjunction, nothing like a but or an and or an or however, or whatever it might be, then when you use a comma in that instance, you get a comma splice, which is a kind of run-on sentence where you've got two different independent clauses. The comma's trying to do too much work. It's just not quite strong enough to separate two independent clauses. The semicolon is strong enough. That's what the dot is. It makes the comma a little bit stronger. It makes it like a super comma. But of course, it's not really a comma. It turns into something more like a period. So why would you use a semicolon rather than a period? Given that in any place other than a list where you use a semicolon, you could instead use a period. What the semicolon tries to do is show that there is a close connection between two different independent clauses. So it's trying to show that these two things really go together. Even though they're separate points, there's separate ideas, they can be made independently as sentences. These things really sort of, lean together, right? I guess if sentences are like this, right? You have, wait, what side am I? All right, sentence one, my head is the period. And then sentence two, right? You've got these two different sentences. What the semicolon does, rather than have the period there, right? We'll take the period out. The semicolon helps sort of lean them together. Right? The sentences, it sort of says, look, these two things really fit together. I feel like an idiot now. Right? The sentences, you're probably sitting there saying to yourself, what, just now? Like you just feel like an idiot? So the two sentences sort of lean together. They're really closely connected. Take a look at the text for an example there. Okay, that's really all I've got to say about the use of language, at least here. So go ahead, read the piece. If you've got any questions, feel free to email me. One last point I want to make about semicolons: you never have to use semicolons. Only use them if you are confident in using them. You've got a good sense of when you would use them and why you want to use them. Don't just sprinkle them in there. They're not like a garnish. They're not some kind of spice where you just kind of, you write something up and you say, all right, I'm going to sprinkle some semicolons in here, and that's going to make it look really fancy, right? No, don't do it. I'm a little impressed, I'll admit, when I see semicolons being used properly. But that in and of itself, properly using semicolons isn't somehow going to like butter me up or put me in a sort of a nicer mood. I'm like, oh, well, use semicolons correctly. So obviously this whole piece is fantastic, and I'm going to give you a whole bunch of extra marks. When I'm looking at the writing of the piece, really what I'm looking for is, well, one, correct grammatical constructions and good word choice and all that sort of thing. But I'm really looking for there not being errors. So it's far better to avoid making an error than to try to do something extra fancy, right? It's not the fanciness that's going to impress me. It's having a good argument, a clear argument, good reasons, clearly supports the conclusion. Having problems in the writing, things like misused semicolons, introduce issues in understanding the ideas and fully understanding the arguments. It impedes the clarity. So it's far better to never use semicolons than to use them incorrectly. So don't feel any pressure to use them. If you're not certain, just don't do it. You just use periods instead, right? You could just construct sentences with conjunctions and use commas and so on. You don't have to ever use a semicolon. You could have a whole career in writing and just not use semicolons. Well, maybe for a list, but even there, you could probably figure out a way to avoid them, right? Make a numbered list or whatever. So just keep that in mind. Don't abuse semicolons. Even if you're using them correctly, don't overuse them. They sort of like an exclamation mark. They're a good piece of emphasis. They're nice to mark a little bit of a difference or to do something a little bit special in some places, but they shouldn't just be all over the place, because that itself, using semicolons all the time, breaks up the writing in kind of a funny way and interrupts the flow, if flow is a way we can talk about good writing. Okay, that's all for today. In fact, that's all for this week. Wonderful. So read the use of language piece. If you've got any questions, feel free to email me or ask me about it. You might also want to consult a writing style guide. There's many different ones on the market, particularly if you yourself, you think you could use some more advice on writing, how to use punctuation correctly or construct clear sentences and so on. Getting one of those guides can be a helpful tool. I've learned many interesting things out of some of them. So you don't need to. I'm just saying, this is a very brief introduction to excellent use of language, particularly in analytic writing. Just pointing out some of the main issues I've seen in people's work over the years. So that's all for this week. I hope you have a most excellent weekend. If you got any questions, feel free to contact me, and I'll be back next Monday talking about our first 2 films in the course. Till then, have a great weekend. I hope you're doing very well, and you'll see me next week. Bye for now.